Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and equally pleasure to welcome you all today via Zoom to the German Council on Foreign Relations. We appreciate your interest in tonight's topic, Russia's challenge to the Euro-Atlantic security order. With its massive military buildup at the border of Ukraine, Russia is challenging international law, the inviolability of borders, and more generally, the post-Cold War security order. The issue is broader than the sovereignty of Ukraine or Ukraine's dealings with NATO. Moscow's proposals for new treaties between Russia and the West contradict the basic principles of behavior on which peace in the Euro-Atlantic area is built. Stakes are very high. Europe has never been closer to a large-scale military conflict on the continent since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So far, the common Western response to the crisis has been to pursue a double strategy of deterrence and dialogue. Unity, Western determination to uphold a credible deterrence, and preparedness to dialogue for de-escalation seem to be the buzzwords of the day. However, in some circles, Western cohesion is questioned. Recent visits by Chancellor Scholz to Washington and Moscow, by President Macron to Moscow and Kiev, the meeting in the Weimar Triangle format in Berlin, and Foreign Minister Baerbock's second visit to Ukraine within 3 months underline the high-level international efforts to solve the crisis peacefully. It's high time to discuss with our distinguished guests what exactly can and should be done to achieve a peaceful outcome. How can we maintain transatlantic unity and cohesion vis-à-vis the Russian threat? What are the right measures and signals to achieve a peaceful outcome? Is public messaging in line with policy preparations? DGAP is very happy to present to you tonight a high-level panel of foreign policy practitioners and analysts with large government experience who have an extended record of dealing with these problems over a long period of their lives. So allow me first to welcome Pierre Vimont. At the moment, he is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. He has accomplished a very successful career in the French Foreign Service and in the European External Action Service. He has been permanent representative of France to the EU, head of cabinet to the French foreign minister, and ambassador of France to the United States. And of course, executive secretary general of the European External Action Service. Many other prestigious postings. He also served as special envoy of the French President Macron on security and trust with Russia. Thank you very much, Pierre, for being with us tonight. Furthermore, we would like to welcome Matthias Lüttenberg, who is Director for Eastern Europe and Caucasus and Central Asia in Germany's Federal Foreign Office. He's a distinguished German diplomat who previously served in the Federal Chancellor's Office, advising Chancellor Merkel, among other things, on Russia policy and post-Soviet affairs. Welcome, Matthias Lüttenberg, and thank you very much for joining us. Furthermore, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Michael Siebert to the panel tonight. Michael serves currently as Managing Director for Russia, Eastern Partnership, Central Asia, and Regional Cooperation and OSCE at the European External Action Service. Prior to that, he had a distinguished career as a German diplomat, both in the Federal Foreign Office and in the Federal Chancellor's Office. Thank you very much, Michael Siebert, for being with us tonight. Now, I'm not sure whether Fiona Hill already joined us. Oh, she did. Very good. Great. So it's very, very happy to have Fiona Hill with us tonight. Right now, Fiona is a senior fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Prior to that, she was a director of strategic planning at the Eurasia Foundation in Washington, D.C. Of course, we all remember her also in her function in the US NSC, where she served 3 different presidents on Russia and Eurasia. Thank you very much, Fiona, for being with us tonight. Last but not least, I want to thank our moderator for tonight, Stefan Meister. Stefan has a very long and successful career in think tanks, serving at the moment as DGAP head of program on political order and democracy. Stefan has extensive experience on Russia and post-Soviet affairs. He's an excellent analyst, a prolific writer, and a nice guy, if I may say so. Now, without further ado, I pass it on to the moderator. I wish you all a very lively debate and interesting insights into a conflict of potentially devastating consequences. Thank you for choosing the DGAP, for spending your early evening with. Stefan Meister, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rolf. Thank you very much for these very nice introductory remarks. I'm very pleasant to moderate this great panel, and we also see how huge the interest is on the topic and also on the Western or the transatlantic responses to the challenge we face at the moment to the European security order. Let me just allow 2 or 3 as a Russia expert, also looking from a Russian perspective. Let me just 2 or 3 phrases to also as introductory. I think from a Russian perspective, the West looks at the moment weak. And for me, it's really a matter also of timing. US president wants to focus on domestic issues and China. We had elections in Germany and we will have elections in France. So I think we are all somehow occupied. And I think that might be also one of the reasons why the Kremlin is doing this now. And I think Putin aims to divide European and transatlantic unity, and he might think really this is the right moment to negotiate the new European security order. And I think what we observed in the last weeks, and I think that would be also a discussion here with the speakers, so there's a lot of demonstration of transatlantic unity, but there are also a lot of different voices on weapons supply, on sanctions, what kind of economic sanctions, also on the assessment. I think that's also my impression. In the US, we seem to be much closer to war than in Europe, where I think still a lot of countries think or governments of countries think that this is a bluff. Yeah, so I think there seems to be also somehow different assessments and maybe also different expectations from each other. At the same time, I think we see now, and this is what Rolf also already said, we see really increasing European activities, yeah, with Macron and now also Scholz, Foreign Minister Baerbock also traveled to Ukraine and to Russia. So I think it's really, diplomacy is really now happening, even if Russia tried to prevent too much diplomacy and really, had a different strategy. I think that's also a positive outcome. So then let's start with our panelists. Each of you have 5 to 7 minutes for an introductory speech. I want to start with Pierre Vimont to ask you maybe 2 questions and just to have this in mind. So how close is the coordination at the moment with Germany and the European partners? It looks like that Macron is the key person also with the European presidency on the negotiations. And also, can you maybe also a little bit explain what brought Macron from Moscow? I had some problems also to understand what are all the positive outcomes, or what are the outcomes of this meeting. It would be great also to have your insights on this, please.
Thank you, Stefan. And thanks to the German Council on Foreign Relations for inviting me to this great panel, where I hope I can bring a useful contribution. I'll try to do my best on this one. Trying to answer straightforwardly your question. I think there are two remarks I would make on European unity and Macron's role that he's trying to play at the moment. The first one is that Europe is not well equipped for a crisis management mode. It's a multilateral institution, and therefore, if you want to go along all the traditional processes, you will never be ready to respond to a crisis that emerge in a sudden and a somewhat provocative way. You need to adapt our decision process to the reality of crisis management. And this is what Macron has been doing. He has consulted a lot of many people, a lot of allies from Washington to Berlin, through the Baltic states, the Brussels institution, Secretary General Stoltenberg in NATO. And at one point he had to go, and he decided to go. That's the first thing. The second remark is that at least we have Europe now showing its role and speaking and having its voice heard, which was maybe not the case a few days ago. And now you have Macron going to Moscow and then to Kiev. You have the German Chancellor about to go to Kiev and Moscow also. So Europe is speaking in unity, and I think strong coordination with its allies, but at least it has something to say. So I think that's the first thing one should keep in mind as we go on. The second point I would like to make in answer to your second part of your question, what was the purpose of going to Moscow and what is the result? I think it was exactly what Macron has been saying time and again while he was in Moscow, and after that while he was in Kiev and then in Berlin. It's how to lower the tension, how to avoid more escalation, more military buildup, and to come to some sort of a situation where you can start a diplomatic process that will bear fruit if possible. So no one should be over-optimistic, but at least if we could cool the situation somewhat and avoid more escalation and more military buildup, that would be already in start. And therefore, what Macron tried to do is to clarify the different challenges that we were facing and try to show ways of solving each of them in different formats. The first one was precisely to have this long conversation with Putin to try to avoid more escalation and more pressure. Will we see some result there in the near future? We will have to see. What you have heard from the ongoing conversation in Moscow, the conversation that took place in Moscow, was that at least on the border between Belarus and Ukraine, things could lower down, the tension could lower down maybe in the near future, and we will have to watch if that happens. The second one was some goodwill to restart the conversation around the implementation of the Minsk agreements in what is called the Normandy format, with the meeting of the 4 diplomatic advisors in Berlin tomorrow. Here again, we will have to see if some positive message comes out of this. I should add another format that we don't talk enough about, which is the trilateral contact group of the OSCE, where you have a sub-political group that meets on a regular basis, where we were in total stalemate now for many months, and where a small glimmer of hope may perhaps appear. We will have to watch this very carefully. But if something can come out of this conversation, then it will be for the better. It will help maybe lower the tension I was saying earlier. And then you have the third, what I would call the third basket, the third dimension of this, which is the medium-term and long-term perspective. what you have called the new European security order. And we know that there are many different issues, many different strands that need to be looked at. Going back to what are the two main or the three main requests from the Russian side: no enlargement of the NATO membership, no arms system in Georgia or at the border with Russia from NATO, and going back to the presence, the military presence that existed before the 1997 agreement between NATO and Russia. All requests that we know very well are not acceptable for the Western side. And I think Macron was very clear on that while he was there. But to look at, from a different perspective, at ways of bringing back some of the arms control agreements that we had in the past and that have slowly crumbled for the last 10 or 15 years on intermediary nuclear forces, on conventional forces, on the transparency of military activities. These are issues on which we can discuss and try to move on. So the whole point of Macron's visit was to try to launch that kind of process with its different strands and to see whether we can move along and start, first of all, by avoiding more escalation as we have seen in recent days. That's what I can say for the time being, and I'll stop there, Stefan.
Thank you very much. Just a quick follow-up question. Macron was also talking about a kind of a new security format or a new format on security. Is there something to discuss, or they have discussed, or is it exactly what you described, different kind of formats? So is there any kind of a new format that you discussed with Putin? Do we have any knowledge about this? Okay.
No, not at this stage. What he said is two things which I think are important. We may be in need of new rules, but you don't set up new rules by forgetting the old ones. And the old principles that were there in the Helsinki process, in the Helsinki Agreement, in the Paris Charter, and since then in many other statements that we have made in the framework of the OSCE. So the point is we must stick to those principles, namely the respect of territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence of nation states in Europe. And that is very important for all of us to be reminded of, because we all subscribed, even Russia subscribed to those principles. So this is a given, and we have to stick to that. But of course, with the years going by, there may have been changes since 1975, as we have seen. We are living in a post-Cold War period. We have seen agreements that were signed, ratified, and then disappeared, as the INF, as the Open Sky Treaty, and some other of these treaties. So why not go back into this and try to look how we can reinvigorate some of these ideas, update, upgrade some of these former agreements, find new ones, and that would be a way of building up a new European security order. Could I go even further? If we manage to get out of the current tension and have this diplomatic process going on, there may be also a role for the European Union to build up a new framework of trade, economic cooperation, climate change cooperation, so on and so forth. That could be useful also to bring back trust and confidence between Russia and its European neighbors.
Thank you very much. Let's hand over to Matthias Lüttenberg. You just recently, you were just in Ukraine with Foreign Minister Baerbock. You will also participate in the meeting of the Normandy format in Berlin. So Normandy format is not dead. Yeah, I think that's also a very positive message that on this level, this meeting takes place. Maybe you can also explain where are we now, and what is Germany's role also in all these processes we have at the moment?
Sure. Thank you very much, Stefan and Mr. Nikel, for inviting me to this very interesting, very timely panel. I've just returned indeed from Ukraine, where I had the pleasure to accompany the foreign minister. There are always many good reasons for a German foreign minister to travel to Ukraine, especially in these times which the DGAP rightly named as Russia's challenge to the Euro-Atlantic security order. This is the time to show solidarity, support and friendship with Ukraine. This is the time to deter Russia from again attacking Ukraine, the time for multi-layered diplomacy, and this is what we see. Let me start with a view to the security situation. We remain extremely worried about the continuing Russian military buildup close to Ukraine's borders in Crimea and at present also in Belarus. But our concerns go back some time ago. Putin on Ukraine in July, where he more or less declared Ukraine should not be a sovereign state and compared the situation in Donbass to a weapon of mass destruction in the hands of Ukraine. Medvedev's statement in October, where he discredited President Zelensky as an interlocutor. And worst of all, in early December, when Putin used the term genocide to describe what might be waiting for the Russian speakers in Ukraine. Rhetorically, the Kremlin has reached the ceiling long ago. The military presence is also unprecedented, and it comes, and I want to say that very clearly, without any sound explanation or even a reason Ukraine might have offered. On the contrary, Ukraine is acting responsibly against this background, and we commend this restraint despite the threat along their borders. Interesting remarks also by Foreign Minister Kuleba today, who thought that diplomacy helps a lot to slow down the escalation. Recent developments, such as the continued troop movements and the joint exercise with Belarus, do not point towards de-escalation. Nevertheless, we will continue our diplomatic efforts in the NATO, but also, of course, in the OSCE, in the EU, in the Normandy format, and bilaterally. What we witnessed over the last couple of weeks is an outstanding example of unity of the Western world, which comes from close coordination and a division of labor. Our position on Ukraine is very clear. The sovereignty, the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which have been violated with the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, are not up for negotiation, and they are neither basic principle, then neither are the basic principles of European security, such as the freedom to choose alliance or the sovereign equality of states, and the principle of indivisible security. There's full alignment here with the US as well, and within NATO, EU, and the G7. Now I have to also address our support to Ukraine. We have been criticized numerous times by doing either too little or the wrong things from different angles. Germany has been assisting Ukraine ever since and increased its support to unprecedented levels since 2014. Not only in the Normandy format, but also our continued engagement for sanctions, for example, in the EU. Germany is today the biggest bilateral donor for Ukraine in the civilian sphere. Overall, Germany has provided more than $2 billion since 2014. Our focus is very large on economic development, energy efficiency, and the support for ongoing reforms in Ukraine. The last 2 days, we had the chance to visit numerous projects that Germany was financing in Ukraine, from military hospitals to NGOs and water infrastructure and many, many other things. We support Ukraine because Ukraine is our partner, a European country with which we share common values and which is striving for closer cooperation with the EU, and we welcome these efforts. We will continue our support for Ukraine's reform agenda, especially regarding the justice reform and to strengthen democracy, rule of law, and fight corruption. As well as, of course, especially in these days, it's important to mention that we also support cybersecurity and the defense against cyber threats in Ukraine. We have also been supporting Ukraine in the military field, especially in the medical sphere with direct support to the military hospital. And we have treated almost 150 soldiers, wounded soldiers in Ukraine, especially those with the most severe injuries that needed after amputation, special treatment, for example. Yesterday in Estonia, we delivered a brand new mobile field hospital to Ukraine with a value of more than 5 million euros, financed by Germany alone. We have to mention also the 5,000 famous helmets here. Just want the audience to know that there has been a request by the Ukrainian embassy to Germany for helmets and vests, and we responded within a few days to this request by offering 5,000 helmets. Foreign Minister Baerbock visited Ukraine on Monday and Tuesday and also visited the line of contact. This is surely a particular sign of solidarity. We met with the SMM's observers. We also met, of course, the foreign minister and the prime minister. The fact that Chancellor Scholz is now planning to travel to Kyiv and Moscow next week underlines Germany's continued efforts in this current crisis. Before that, Chancellor Scholz visited Washington this Monday, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States, and another attack on Ukraine would be met with a joint and massive response by Europe and the United States. That was very clear. Clearly voiced in Washington, and I'm sure it was understood. The meeting of the Weimar Triangle yesterday is another important element of our coordination with the French, but also with the Polish colleagues and the president in particular. NATO is ready for dialogue with Russia, and we aim for concrete outcomes. Of course, we will not compromise on the core principles of the European security architecture, including the freedom to choose alliances, and I fully subscribe to what Pierre Vimont has just said. We have delivered our proposals to Russia. Our invitation is out there. We are willing to engage in serious, substantive discussions. And we are waiting for Russia's reaction. The Normandy format and the TCG, the Trilateral Contact Group, represent another important dialogue track where Russia and Ukraine are negotiating directly with each other. While negotiations are sometimes difficult, it is important that these meetings have resumed. And it's important that they continue. Last time in Paris on the 26th of January, then in Berlin tomorrow. I'm dealing with this Normandy format since 2014, and I was very often quite frustrated because of the lack of progress. But now I feel for the first time that it has a particular value in this situation, not only because we are meeting, but because we address the core issues of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship, especially with a view to Donbass, but this also goes beyond. And therefore I see a great chance that this will contribute to a de-escalation overall. We support the efforts of Poland as chairperson in office to the OSCE, and I'm very happy to see that the first meeting has taken place and that will hopefully continue. We also support further dialogue between the US and Russia, coordination on European security of EU and member states with the United States and NATO shows our unity and our determination. We expect Russia to unequivocally de-escalate and to revert to the diplomatic channels. However, we made it clear to Russia that if another aggression against Ukraine should occur, this will be met with severe political, economic, and strategic consequences. As has been made clear by my government and as well as by leaders of the EU and member states on numerous occasions, in the case of Russian invasion, the EU will implement unprecedented sanctions against Russia, and Germany is ready to bear a significant part of that, as in 2014. And as Foreign Minister Baerbock said, all options are on the table, including Nord Stream 2. The transatlantic alliance is the bedrock of European and German security. Germany is fully committed to NATO and therefore takes security concerns of our allies very seriously. And this is not only why we engage so much in the Baltic area and in other countries, but we also decided to increase and to reinforce the battle group of NATO's enhanced forward presence in Lithuania by another 350 soldiers, in close coordination with our Lithuanian allies. To sum it up, we all do not know what Putin will be doing, and we should prepare for every possible scenario, from hybrid, cyber, to major invasions. On the other hand, the last weeks have, until today, proven the capacity of NATO and the EU to keep the lines closed, to speak with one voice, coordinate, and send very clear messages to Moscow on deterrence and dialogue. And this has not gone unnoticed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just have a quick, also a quick follow-up question. I think you are right. I think Germany is doing quite a lot of, especially for Ukraine. Yeah, so I think it's one of the biggest donors, if it's not the biggest donor. And on the other hand, I think this criticism comes from somewhere. Yeah, and I asked myself, is it the right strategy to not make clear what are the costs for any action? So my impression is that the federal government has the strategy to keep this ambiguity and make no clear statements. And this has created confusion also among the allies. So do you really think that the right strategy is to keep this ambiguity and be not really clear and have these different voices also in the parliament, for instance, where it's not clear who speaks for whom? So it's not about the parliament, but the main question is about this strategy, let's call it like this, of ambiguity about what will cost what.
Well, thank you, Stefan. I think a certain degree of ambiguity is really an important factor here, because if you're serious about sanctions, you need to have the EU 27 on board, and we are closely coordinating with all 27, and the EU is doing a wonderful job in this regard. What could be our possible replies to any sort of aggressive behavior by Russia? And of course, these consultations are ongoing. And I can tell you that we are discussing certain areas of sanctions, and most of them are already known. But on the other side, no decisions are taken yet because we don't know exactly what will happen. And it would be premature, I would assume, to already now put all the cards on the table and somehow give a price tag to each sort of aggression, be it a minor incursion, as President Biden would call it, or be it a major invasion of Ukraine. And this is difficult for us to already name this price tag for each and everything. And if you're looking at Nord Stream 2, for example, this has been mentioned by almost every member of the German government, with maybe not always the same words, but I always refer to our joint statement that we agreed upon with the United States in July 2021, where we clearly said that if further aggressive acts should occur, then Germany will push for sanctions, including in the import of gas and including on pipelines, without singling out Nord Stream 2, because there are 5 pipelines at least, which are connecting Russia and Germany or Europe, and it would be a little bit too little to only refer to one of them.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's switch to the US perspective. Fiona, when I'm talking with US colleagues, I have the impression we are already in a war. So I see here really a lot of military scenarios, and I really feel a different threat perception in Washington than I do it in Berlin sometimes, and also in other capitals. How you see this kind of so how is the view in Washington at the moment on the situation? Not analyzing any detail, but how do you see this? Do you see this difference too, and where it is coming from? And what are the expectations from Washington also on the European partners in this crisis?
Well, first of all, Stefan, I think. Well, actually, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure where the difference is coming from. If indeed, as people are assuring me, we are actually sharing the intelligence with our partners, at least at the very top level. Because the assessments that are being made, and I used to be the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia, back in the day, and I've done plenty of this myself, the warnings that are coming out of the US system are based on what they see as the facts on the ground. So we're seeing unprecedented movement of military forces on the Russia's behalf. The United States wasn't necessarily expecting this. I think there was a bit of a surprise, not just back in the spring when they first saw the movements, but since then with the evident escalation that we've had at the end of last year. So it's obviously gone beyond what we usually see for exercises, which of course we keep a very close eye on in the Russian context. And in some respects, this ties back to several of the things that have already been said, especially by Pierre Vimont, about the breakdown in some of the structures for the European Security Order. If we still had the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty in place, which was suspended by Russia in 2007, and then essentially disregarded by them from 2015 onwards, we would have the right to review exercises, get advance notification, and possibly also be able to send observers, reciprocal basis. So what we've seen is obviously been coming in from intelligence or commercial satellites. I mean, there are groups like Bellingcat and many others, who can get access to satellites to see movements on the ground. And we've seen, as I said, again, things that go beyond a regular exercise. We've seen the movement of forces from the Russian Far East to the Ukrainian border. And I think in that regard, just to add another dimension to this for as we move on with our discussion, the recent declarations and pronouncements and agreements by Russia and China on the edges of the Beijing Winter Olympics are also very significant, because Russia clearly feels that there is no need for it to maintain its force posture in the Far East against China, because, I mean, although we've seen military exercises, joint military exercises between China and Russia, we've always assumed, I think, on a good basis, that the force posture in the Far East military district is directed against China, not just against Japan and the United States, for example. So I want to throw that out there for part of our discussion. We can't just think about this in a European context. There's a much broader frame that is in play here as well. So we've seen the Russians move troops from the Russian Far East and equipment. We've seen these deployments in Belarus. I mean, that has been a game changer for United States military analysts, because again, it's gone beyond regular exercises. And there is now the assessment from our intel people and also those who are working in more of an open source environment, that within a week and a half to 2 weeks, which of course will be the same timing as the end of these declared exercises in Belarus, February 20th, also the end of the Winter Olympics thereabouts, that the Russians will then have sufficient forces in place to launch a large-scale invasion into Ukraine. So what you're seeing from the United States, and having done this before, is a classic intelligence warning. And, I think the United States has also been very much influenced by experience in the past with counterterrorism. If you get information about a plot, you warn about it. And I think that this is kind of part of the delicate issue. You just asked, Matthias Lüttenberg about the issue about being more direct rather than being ambiguous. The United States has been very direct about what it's seeing, so it's not being ambiguous. And of course, the Ukrainians, are asking us to tamp it down. I spent some time yesterday with the Ukrainian ambassador, explaining that, kind of obviously saying, which is a classic intel warning. You don't want people to, kind of miss something. You say, this is imminent. We see all the signs here of an imminent attack, right? Or a hurricane or a tornado warning. We do this all the time. But the Ukrainians are saying, look, not helpful, sowing panic, there'll be a run on our currency and, kind of a crash of the economy. Could you tamp it down a little bit? Yes, we've got it. We're mobilizing, we're getting prepared. I think there's also another factor at work here in the United States that, we I would say, underreacted on previous occasions. So if we go back to 2008, after the Bucharest summit with NATO, when Georgia and Ukraine got the promise that they would be in NATO at some point, but no clear plan. Again, I was the national intelligence officer. We were warning all the time that the Russians were likely to take preemptive military action. And, we were warning for several months, even before the summit, and then for, a period afterwards. Nobody paid a great deal of attention. And when they actually, the Russians came down the rocky tunnel in 2008, I mean, Pierre and others may remember some of this, there was shock, but we'd been warning all this time that something was very likely to happen. We just didn't exactly pick the right day and the right occasion. We actually thought it would happen in Abkhazia, that there'd be some pretext that the Russians would pull the Georgians into an attack in Abkhazia, or that the Georgians might do that themselves, honestly, and then that would be where the trigger for a Russian invasion would come from, but instead it came from South Ossetia somewhat later than we'd anticipated. And because the United States didn't react so strongly then, it was actually, again, another French president, President Sarkozy, who intervened to try to, de-escalate a situation which was already very hot with a full-scale Russian invasion into South Ossetia going much broader. I mean, we all remember the events of that time. We also then didn't react very strongly until, of course, MH17 and the shooting down the Malaysian Airlines plane in the case of the annexation of Crimea and the triggering off the war in Donbass. Then, you know, Russia makes its moves into Syria as well. So you see the pattern here that, you know, we have failed to react until after the fact on so many other issues, that now that the United States has got all of this intelligence, the Brits have as well, you know, we've been trying to share this really widely. We're now, you know, perhaps some will say that we're overreacting, but we're trying to put out there, you know, in response to all the things we didn't do previously, the information that we actually have. So I think that that actually is the root of the problem. And I think our issue for all of us to discuss is how to manage that, how to manage the warning aspect of it, you know, without, you know, basically escalating or creating some kind of preemptory cycle on the part of the Russians or others, for example, and trying to manage the diplomacy at the same time of this. I think warning is an art, not just a science. It's very difficult. And of course, if nothing actually happens, then those people who were warning may be blamed, you know, for false alarms, rather than, you know, looking at the fact that, well, perhaps the warning in advance was sufficient to enable us to, as Pierre and Matthias is saying, try to de-escalate the situation in some way. I would just say that for now, there is no signs of de-escalation from the military vantage point. And that becomes really problematic. And that ties into the last part of your question, Stefan, because what we really need is for the United States and Europe to stay latched together. Because it will only be through unified response, clear messaging, as all being on the same page, that we'll be able to deal with this. My own view is that we're in for a long haul, that the Russians are not interested in diplomacy, particularly at this point. I mean, I'm also keeping my fingers crossed that President Macron might have had some success about putting the Russians on notice. It was a 5-hour meeting, so I already commend him for his stamina and endurance of, you know, really being able to engage on this for 5 hours. That's really a very difficult, job. But I think we're going to have to be thinking about this, not just in the short to medium term, but the long term as well. What do we do, for example, if the Russians make the military presence in Belarus now permanent? You know, maybe at the end of the exercises, that we now find that they have actually created permanent placements in Belarus, even though some of the forces get withdrawn. What indeed if the Belarusian constitution is changed, as there seems to be these machinations about this right now. We don't know whether they will, but that's certainly floating out there for the placement of Iskander missiles in Belarus. You know, as Pierre mentioned, INF and, you know, Open Skies and all the other transparency initiatives, absolutely, yes, we should be discussing all of this. But of course, the United States pulled out of INF because Russia was violating. And we are actually, you know, still, or we have been adhering, you know, to many of the terms of those agreements. We haven't really, you know, there aren't nuclear missiles close to Russia's borders in Europe, but there are plenty of Russian Iskanders in Kaliningrad and, you know, perhaps potentially now in Belarus that we're going to have to contend with. So I think that when we, you know, looking ahead to the renegotiation of those treaties, which was always on the United States agenda, Russia clearly wants to do that on their terms as well. So I think, you know, part of our problem now is putting all of this together. And as I said again, it's not just about Europe, because one of the other reasons for when the United States pulled out of INF, and we're also talking about New START, you may recall, was also about how to factor in China. And Russia also was thinking about its own intermediate nuclear force posture in the Far East. They always say this is directed against Japan and the United States, but we always saw that Russia was hedging against a very far off in the future eventuality of China, you know, having built up a pretty massive arsenal of intermediate as well as strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. And Russia wants the United States to recognize it as a major player in the Asia Pacific. Not just in Europe, and is tying lots of things together there as well. So this is unfortunately very complicated, and I think we're in for the long haul. And so we have to figure out how we can all stay latched together and have discussions on European security that will also take into account things that are happening in other theatres.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important point also, that China is very closely observing how the US and NATO react in Europe, yeah? And maybe what kind of conclusion it can take from this. Just a quick question, I'm also looking to the time, but I wanted to ask you this question. If we look to Putin since 2012, He has systematically built up the US and NATO as its main enemies, as a legitimization resource, yeah, in a situation where he was under pressure. Does he not get now exactly what he was always talking about, finally? So more US troops in Europe, more military build-up, yeah, so he has created in the end the enemy, which was not there. Yeah, so how would you see this kind of, I think that this kind of result of the Russian policy and our reaction we have now? I don't know what is the alternative, but my impression is Putin got somehow what he wants, the enemy he wants. He can sell maybe also at home.
Yes, look, Stefan, I think that's an absolute risk, because I mean, he may be able to use that as a pretext. I mean, in one respect, it's a miscalculation if indeed, you know, he wanted the opposite. But if he is looking for a pretext, he can certainly spin it in that way as well. So yes, I think we have to be very mindful of that. And that will also have to be factored into our, not just our short term, but our medium and long term thinking. I completely agree that this is, you know, a risk that we're running, even as we absolutely have to respond to this.
Okay, thank you. So after Michael, thank you very much. After Michael Siebert, you can ask also questions. Everybody can ask questions. You can also write some questions in the chat. I will also collect questions just to then also to bring the auditorium in. So Michael, happy to have you also here for this discussion. Where's the EU in all this? So we have US is active, NATO, we see France and also now Germany is even more active. So what is the role of the EU in this how to say, in this reaction to the biggest security challenge you can say since the end of the Cold War for Europe?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Rolf Nikel. Pleasure to be here. The EU, you pointed to it, may have a little bit of a more different role in this multi-layered process than some other actors, and I may have a little bit more difficult or easier role being the last panelist here. Because I agree with a lot, almost everything that has been said by my predecessors speaking. What is the role of the EU? Or let me go one step back and say that we believe that the situation is still open, that war is not necessarily coming. There are very compelling evidence that we basically now share very much across the Atlantic, that it is a distinct possibility, and that very soon all the ingredients for a relatively big-sized war are present in the east and at the border of Ukraine. But I believe that President Putin still has many cards in his hand, and he is maybe not known as a grand strategist, but as a shrewd tactician. So I'm not even sure he knows himself which cards he will play in the next few weeks of those he holds in his hands. So this gives us room for diplomacy, and I'm sure that we can still influence the sequence of events to come. We don't know, by the way, whether he is more focusing on Ukraine as such, preventing it from becoming a member of NATO ultimately, sure, or is it more about the security setup in Europe in general? I think the Russian actions will also depend on our action or on our reaction. So what role for the EU in all of this? We try to, first of all, as the High Representative Borrell has said, we try to have a place at the table. But that doesn't mean that we physically, of course, are present at each table where things are debated. Of course not. It's more in the sense that we are concerned and that we are taken into the discussion and contributing to it when our own security is concerned. And I'm very happy that the transatlantic link here has been much intensified over the last weeks and months, and it was a perfect coordination across the Atlantic on our policies and on our messaging. What can the EU do in that? We have achieved, I think, a very close common line between the 27 member states with the Foreign Affairs Council conclusions end of January. And the High Representative has been in touch constantly over the last weeks, not only with his Ukrainian colleague, and we went to the line of contact early January, but also with Secretary Blinken, with Secretary General Stoltenberg, with Polish Prime Minister Rau as the chairman in office of the OSCE, and of course with Germany and France also represented here tonight as the N2, Normandy 2 partners. And I think, if I may say so, it was an important element in forging this common message vis-a-vis Russia that we have achieved in doing. Second thing we can do as the EU is, of course, help Ukraine. I will not go into a competition with Matthias about who is the biggest donor, but the EU has given some 17 billion euro over the last 7 years, and we just again promised 1.2 billion and plus 120 million in grants. Very important now to help Ukraine cope with what is already affecting them on this side of any potential military action. As has been mentioned before, the refinancing costs have been on the rise for Ukraine, and they suffer from the uncertainty and in certain corners panic that goes with this situation. Of course, we support them when they suffer cyber attacks, hybrid attacks. We're in close coordination with them on such kind of things. And we will continue to support them politically. I've invited Foreign Minister Kuleba to the next Foreign Affairs ministers meeting in 10 days. The third thing I think the EU can contribute is sanctions preparation. And again, I think we have played a very instrumental role in, on the one hand, internally talk with all the 27 member states on what would be as we have framed it, massive response at high cost to impose on Russia in case of a military intervention in Ukraine. We are very close, I think, and Matthias confirmed that, to packing this package, finalizing this package of sanctions in various areas. And again, here I won't go into details, but I think some things have become public, and it's probably good that in general, the dimension of potential sanctions has become public. While, as has been explained by others, we surely believe that we should not go by saying if Russia does A, B, C, we will do X, Y, Z. We become calculable, and Russia may be willing to run the risk in the end. So it should be very open, and surely there are very far-reaching options on the table that could also, contrary to 2014, because we are now preparing for it, for the potentiality, could become a reality very quickly in a matter of days, as we would even go to look at the legal text, etc., to prepare for any potentiality. So Russia knows that we will act decisively in case of an attack on Ukraine. And not only are we doing this with the member states, but we are reaching out and almost having daily contacts with our American partners. Again, grateful for that great cooperation and with others like the United Kingdom. So we are preparing for the worst while we still hope for better. And the preparation for the worst should be one element in preventing it, hopefully. And very briefly, a fourth point, we also, of course, are also concerned here in Brussels with the resilience of the European Union in case of military events against in Ukraine. And that is, for instance, just to mention one area is the energy supply, the energy security of Europe. We are here out to reach out to our US partners that are already, I think, our biggest LNG suppliers. We are in talks with many countries like Qatar, Azerbaijan, with East Asian partners, etc., to make sure that our industries and the flats of our citizens will not have to be shut down in the worst case. Maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was also important. Yeah, also these different contributions. I would rather go now into questions. So you can also raise your hand down in the reaction button, and can also write questions in the chat. I try to follow everything. Let's start with Uli Speck's question. There is a direct question to Pierre Vimont. From Macron's perspective, how this new security order should look like. So what would be from a French perspective, or Macron perspective, this new European security order? Maybe you can react directly to this.
Yes, with pleasure, Stefan. A difficult question, and I'm not even sure that Macron himself would pretend that he has a full-fledged answer to that. It could very well be a step-by-step approach. Going back to what Fiona was saying a few minutes ago, the different pieces of arms control and conventional forces, I would add open sky, etc., that were there many years ago and that we could try to rekindle and to reset by some extent, will only form some part of a European security order that would be upgraded and revisited after what we have done in the 70s, the 80s, and even in the post-Cold War period. The whole issue for me, it's about stability. Are we able through this crisis, and if we manage to lower the atmosphere and to de-escalate, to move into a diplomatic process that will end with more stability in Europe and a long-term stability. If that is really the goal we're all looking for, in other words, to do what we didn't manage to do after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that would be great, but that will be a very long process, no doubt about it. And we may find new ideas as we move along. The whole point of Emmanuel Macron was that you have to keep that in mind while you move ahead out of if possibly, out of the current tension. You have to keep this long-term perspective in mind. And for 1 second, also going back to what Fiona was saying, I think this objective, this long-term objective, this long-term vision of what could be a European stability is even more undermined by the fact that, as Fiona was saying, I fear we are in the long haul with regard to the current tension. We may very well be in this situation where hopefully there will be no more escalation, but also no more de-escalation, no de-escalation, a sort of freezing of the current situation, which will make life very difficult for all of us. How to sustain that level of tension for a long time with the kind of diplomatic efforts that we're trying to push forward, that could be difficult, because my personal impression while I was visiting Moscow a few days ago is that the Russians had this impression, and I understand that impression from their point of view, the impression of being in a sort of comfort zone. They have put their agenda on the table. We're trying to respond to that. They have forced us to look at some of the major issues they want us to discuss. And therefore, they're feeling that at the moment, they can go along with this. And therefore, this kind of high intensity pressure may go on for some time, which will make the diplomat's life more difficult.
Thank you very much. Let's take several questions, and then I would give it back just to now we have more questions also coming in. And I would start with those people who are raising the hands. I would really ask you shortly introduction, just name who you are, and then please ask a question, and no co-presentation. So Rainer Meyer-Zumfelde, please, you are the first.
Oh, thank you for the honor. Rainer Meyer-Zumfelde, former Brigadier General and German representative in the NATO Defense Policy and Planning Committee until 2017. My question is on this ambiguity versus clarity issue concerning German positions. I mean, I understand fully that we are a bit reluctant on Ukraine, but as Fiona Hill made it very clear, and I agree, this goes far beyond just the Ukraine. And we need to be aware that our allies in NATO expect Germany to provide now the necessary reassurance to our allies as well, and also taking then China, taking Russian side, obviously, into account. And what I miss, with all understanding of the pressure on our Chancellor to not be too outspoken, but what I miss is that we are now at a position we at least should publicly make a statement that from now on, Germany will fully and faster implement all those measures to strengthen deterrence and defense alongside with dialogue, which we have made since Wales 2014, and where we are clearly lagging in implementation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just to add, I think there's also a question going in this direction. Does it really make a difference if it's about Ukraine or European security, or the European security order? Is not also the question about the future of Ukraine a question about the European security order? I think that's a very important question in my opinion. Rostislav Valvoda is the next.
Hello, a question on the stability argument.
Introduction. Just who are you?
I'm the executive director of Prague Civil Society Center. We're an organization working to support journalists and civil society across former Soviet Union. Question on the stability. It seems to me that somehow we have this idea that, you know, Russians are unhappy, that put proposals on the table, we talk to them, and somehow then situation will become more stable. And I find this fundamentally misreading the situation, because in my view, Vladimir Putin has all the reasons to actually create instability. He has made creating conflict his policy. And so my question is, how should we factor this in, our planning, into our strategizing, if they have no interest in stability, if they have interest in creating conflict, also because for internal reasons, and we will not, you know, no amount of redesigning security architecture will take away the inherent insecurities that the Russian regime has about its own population. They have the same underlying social processes happening as happened in Belarus. And I think they have all the good reasons to be very insecure about something similar happening to them as happened to Lukashenko. So, and these things will not be taken away by any amount of international talks. So how should we adjust our planning for this idea that they want to create conflict? Thank you.
I will take more questions, so please note down the questions, and I will give you then in the end a chance to answer to some of the questions, so that we have answers from different perspectives. So Judy, maybe you are the next, and I can also read out then later questions.
Sorry, this is a terrific panel, and it's a very important one, and it goes back to the stability.
Can you also introduce yourself, even if most of the people might know you?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. My name is Judy Dempsey, and what do? I edit the Strategic Europe blog for Carnegie Europe, which is linked to the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. And Pierre is one of our great scholars and contributors, and several of you also are. I have a question which relates to this stability issue. First of all, does Putin want stability, or does he favor instability in order to divide the West and test the West's ability to think strategically? Because if you look at the kind of elements coming out of Moscow at the moment, there's no effort to even discuss arms control. So that's what I really want to know is the West at psychological and intellectual and political odds with the current Russian administration on how they view this relationship?
Thank you. I take Klaus Wittmann at this point, and then I would read out some of the questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Klaus Wittmann, former Brigadier General and teaching contemporary history at Potsdam University. I would like to share one thought with Fiona Hill and ask her what she thinks about it. In my view, everything that Putin calls security interests of Russia are not really interests in the sense of the word, but they are political, psychological sensitivities, Befindlichkeiten. Wounded pride, loser in the Cold War, imperial phantom pain, disintegration of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, Russia's victim, self-perception, frustration at not being taken seriously as an equal by the USA, and so on. What is real an interest is that he wants to prevent democratic success in Russia's neighborhood as a threat to his system of power. And is that not why it is so difficult to get him to compromise on anything? Because that is an existential interest for him, to keep the democratic virus as far away from Russia as possible.
Thanks. Yeah, question taken. I just read out 2 or 3 questions, and then I would give it back to the panel, and we have a final round. And Nika Abasi asked, can the present situation be compared with the Cuban Missiles Crisis? If not, what is different this time? Not discussing the geography. I think that's clear. There's a question to Michael Siebert. Does our calculation on sanctions include the boomerang costs, so the costs also for the EU? Are we preparing to cope with that too? I think that's also the question, how far we are willing, so how much it can hurt also from also our side. What would be your perspective? I think would be also interesting maybe to hear the German perspective. In the case of sanctions, there's another question on sanctions. In the case of sanctions by the EU, is acceptance by all member states needed? So is there, maybe also to Michael Siebert, will there be a agreement needed by all member states, and will we get this? Let's take this question by Stefan Meister. So we're talking about the EU, Germany, France, and the US, prepare for possible humanitarian needs of local population in Eastern Ukraine in case of another attack. Also on a possible new wave of refugees, and at which level and with which assumption? So is there preparation also on concrete issues, especially on humanitarian needs? I think that's also an important question. How much have the joint statements on cooperation between China and Russia changed the dynamics? So what does this mean, this meeting, and how it impacts also, and it might change the dynamic. And I take maybe one more question. There are many questions now coming in. The ongoing threat to Ukraine's sovereignty is now spilling over into Belarus. I think it's really important also, Fiona mentioned this, how the calculation is changing with what happens now in Belarus. One gets the impression that Russia has already succeeded in gaining a factual foothold, and Lukashenko is basically fortified sovereignty of his country. Surely this has not gone unnoticed, but are we able to counter this in a proper way? And maybe you can also explain what is the calculation. So is this about Ukraine, or is it maybe going beyond Ukraine? I think that's what would be for me also the question, what happens in Belarus. So maybe I give it back to you now, because there were many questions and we also need to answer them. If you want to pick up one or two from the chat, you can also do this, and I will further go through it. But I would go maybe in the reversed order, starting with Michael Siebert, to answer the questions which are directed to you, but also the questions you think which you would like to answer. And again, you can also pick up more from the chat if you want. Michael.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan. I won't monopolize the time. So maybe first to the sanctions, because this is very much addressed also to the European Union. I have the distinct impression that we know what would be the cost of imposing hard sanctions on Russia, and with the Russian stance that we see ongoing at the moment, that my feeling is that there is increasing unity, and that the preparations, as I said initially, are well underway for a very comprehensive package in case Ukraine would be attacked. And this also goes, of course, with hedging of consequences. I mentioned the energy situation. We believe hopefully would be manageable. Of course, costs would go up, but it would be manageable. And we are, of course, also looking at possible Russian countermeasures to possible sanctions. And then the question on who needs to agree on sanctions, this is very easy to answer. It's by unanimity of the 27 member states that sanctions can be taken. And it's on that basis that we also coordinate with our partners across the Atlantic. Then the question on humanitarian preparations, maybe, which are underway in the European Union. We have ECHO to look into this, and they work with various scenarios, which include potential needs in Ukraine, but also in neighboring countries. And they do it in close cooperation also with other institutions, including UNHCR. And then maybe last point from my side on what does Russia want, stability or not, and how far will it go, Belarus. This is all, of course, coming together in a way. My take on this is that Russia, we are always saying Russia, but it's basically President Putin, it's the Kremlin, it's the clique around him that are basically interested in preserving the stability as they have it now in Russia. I think this will also govern their actions, and they will take into account the fact that I believe that a war against Ukraine, a fully fledged war against Ukraine, would not be overly popular with the majority of the Russian population. To go out against a Slavic country where lots of family and friends and so on, connections are still there, it might not help the Kremlin to stabilize the situation in Russia, which is already getting more difficult, as we can see with the ongoing repression, which is the other side of the coin of this outside aggression in their politics. And a similar argument goes for Belarus, in my view. They will go very incrementally in solidifying the union state and bringing Belarus even closer to Russia. But they will be also careful, because this is maybe one thing that is not very popular in Belarus. And if Lukashenko has achieved one thing, then it's probably a rising national feeling in Belarus and the wish of Belarusians not to be part of Russia. So, and when you add to it that there was quite some sympathy in Russian population for the demonstrations in Belarus 2 years ago, here are probably the limits of what President Putin might want to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to add for the three speakers who will still answer one question, I think, which is very difficult to answer, but I think it's very important. How can a diplomatic solution look like? So where can the West, US and Europe compromise? Is there a middle where we can meet with Russia? So because we're talking about this diplomatic solutions and diplomatic processes, I think that's in our interest to bring Russia into a process. Yeah. So, but Russia was trying to prevent exactly this kind of process, and now it's somehow struggling with it. So it didn't maybe not get what it wanted. But how? So where could we meet? How this could look like? So Fiona, maybe you are the next to answer. Also, there were also some questions to you directly.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stefan, everyone. I've tried to make a note of some of the questions we've gone along. I won't be able to answer all of them, but I'll try to do some of them. And I think that that last question, Stefan, about what a diplomatic solution will look like will be extraordinarily difficult to even find something like that while we're in, what many people are calling a hostage crisis. Steve Erlanger, who's online here somewhere, said it's, kind of in a note a bit earlier that it's a hostage crisis while we're all trying to talk, while, the gun is still being held to Ukraine's head. And that makes it extraordinarily difficult because, the United States has also made it clear that we can get to all of these other discussions if there's a de-escalation. And I think, as we've all been saying here, and, I agree with, many of the points that, Judy and Rostislav and others have also raised this, that I'm not sure that Putin wants any de-escalation right now. And, you, Stefan, asked about, Ukraine and European security. I think those are one and the same for Putin. And, the dilemma that we actually have is, and we see this in Belarus as well, is that, Mikhail, Siebert has just talked about this, what Russia really wants is their stability. And, we call it, the risks of democratization or democracy in Ukraine, but really what it is Ukraine moving away from a more opaque, crony capitalism, kleptocracy towards something that's more transparent, even if it might not be a full-blown, European style democracy. Even then we've had some backsliding, different places in Europe as well as in the United States. What Putin really wants is to have the stability of the people that he knows and the people around him in that Kremlin clique that Mikhail talked about, to still be in power. Part of the trigger for what's happening in Ukraine is the fact that Zelensky, who Putin had no connections with before, basically has started to try to clean shop and you know, basically get rid of people who are opponents to him that happen to be tied to Moscow as well. I mean, that's part of the factors there. And you might recall when we go back to 2014, when Viktor Yanukovych fled, you know, and headed off to Voronezh rather than staying in place, Putin said, now there is no one to talk to in Ukraine, meaning that his guy, the guy that he knew how to talk to, the person he knew how to have an influence over, had, you know, basically taken off. And I think this is what Rastislav was talking about when you look across, you know, the whole arena here. Belarus, they're kind of stuck with Lukashenko because now they kind of see that the alternatives to Lukashenko are just not there. And so that, you know, as you said, he's managed to entrench himself in power, but at a massive cost of selling out Belarus. But, you know, he's the devil that they know. And one of our permanent problems on a diplomatic solution is that what Putin really wants is a veto and a decision, you know, making power over who is in charge in all of the countries on their borders. And that is going to be something that we are not going to be able to make an arrangement with. And what they hate about us, I mean, us writ large, is that we're always trying to, you know, kind of push transparency, good governance, and, you know, kind of changes in the elite system and move away from crony capitalism. Now, they were quite pleased with what was happening in the United States recently, not so, you know, pleased now by a return to sort of normalcy on those scores. And the more that we push on anti-corruption in Ukraine and elsewhere, the more that the Russians feel very nervous because of exactly what we said about the spillover effects into Russia. They're just nervous about the same thing. As Mikkel said, they want their stability and we are destabilizing everything. So basically they want us to go away and we're not doing that. So I think that, you know, when we look at all of this together, that's pretty critical. And look, that gets back to the whole, you know, Cuban Missile Crisis. This isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yes, the Russians have said they're going to make it into the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Caribbean Crisis. They talk about it. They're also talking about the Euro Missile Crisis. But it isn't as simple about the placement of missiles. It's about the placement of people. Because Putin, it's a highly personalized system and he wants to have those personal connections. Look what just happened in Kazakhstan and Armenia. There was a power struggle going on in Kazakhstan, but Putin wanted to intervene to make sure that Tokayev, who is of course quite closely connected with Moscow, remained so. Pashinyan in Armenia was not closely connected with Moscow. He is now, you know, after all of the events of 2020. So again, we're going to have to, you know, factor that in, that there's this personalized element related to their own personal security of the Kremlin clique and all the people that they're connected to. We see it in our own politics. They want, right now, the Russians are making a bid to the United States that they want an interlocutor. They keep talking about Henry Kissinger, who is probably a little old for doing shuttle diplomacy at this particular point of view. But they want somebody who they think is somebody who can see things from their viewpoint. They always want to kind of bypass the system of boring, bureaucratic, foreign diplomats and security like the rest of all of us, and have someone that they feel that can have a connection with to personalize the whole thing, to get their points across. So this is the dilemma that we have right now. And I just wanted to make one more comment about China, because I think there really has been a game changer with the Chinese statements. I mean, this is the first time that China's come out with anything that's explicitly anti-NATO, NATO enlargement. One would say, really? You know, are you really genuinely worried about that? The Chinese have also been telling, you know, many other interlocutors behind the scene that the European Union is okay now, and, you know, for Ukraine and other members, because of course China has the EU as a major negotiating and, you know, trade partner. So maybe, Mikkel, there's something here for an EU discussion with China, actually. Because, I mean, there is some notable things about China. They've given Russia, obviously, a pass, so they don't have to worry about their far eastern border. China's probably saying, we've got your back, go and do whatever it is that you're doing over there, and putting pressure. They're watching it very closely to see how this plays out, you know, maybe perhaps to their own ideas, not just with Taiwan, but look, they had a shooting match with India over the borders in the Himalayas. I think we should be very nervous about, you know, what the precedent this sets. But China has made it clear that they have their own interests and relationships with Ukraine. They have their own interests with Europe. They haven't recognized Crimea, and they still haven't recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And I do think that engaging with the Chinese, perhaps the EU is one of China's major trading partners and a, you know, kind of a market of great interest to China. There can be some points made there, but this recent statement by the Russia and China really is a game changer, because it shows that they're basically ganging up together against the United States in particular. So again, it's not just about Ukraine and European security tied together, but also about the US and the US global posture that has to be factored in.
Thanks. Also raising this China issue, I think to have the bigger picture, I think that's also important. Matthias, please, I think there were a lot of tricky questions.
Thank you very much. There were so many questions, but I'd start with the first one. It was on the ambiguity and our reaction. I want to underline that the ambiguity is only valid and useful in terms of the sanctions that we are about to prepare and that we might take in the case of an invasion. When it comes to the security of NATO alliance, of course, Article 5 is the rule that we will be following, and Germany has been a very staunch supporter of Article 5 and also of fortifying the eastern flank, if I may say so, with the forward presence and all of these things that I don't need to explain here, especially not to a military. But I beg to differ. The ambiguity is not the right means of choice when it comes to the security of the alliance and its territory. But on sanctions against Russia, on Ukraine, this is exactly what we're doing right now. But there's no room for ambiguity. And the other point, on Ukraine, and is this a matter of European security? We raised this question more or less also with the Russians. And for them, on the one side, they would like to differentiate between the Normandy 4 and the security in Europe. But of course, Ukraine is exactly the test case for these ambitions that Putin has put on the table in his demands. Take NATO enlargement, take the spheres of influence and the question of what weapons can be stationed where, and all of this has to do. But of course, the democratic virus that it was so rightly said is the biggest fear that Putin has, and this, of course, will not stop only because of new security arrangements. But it's interesting that, for example, in the US Russian draft that the Russians have sent, there's also an element of not interfering into each other's domestic policies. And this is exactly what they are also afraid of, beyond all the hard security issues that are on the table. Here, I would agree that Putin has no illusions about the NATO or the US readiness to discuss all of these questions. He knows our red lines, and he knows that we are protecting them. And this is exactly the approach on how can a solution look like. The question is the most important one. Now, we have chosen one way as NATO, as EU. This is the attempt to offer a dialogue on those issues where we also have an interest in a solution, be it transparency or risk reduction, many other areas. But there are certain red lines that we protect, and this has been communicated very clearly also to Russia, that there will be no negotiating about certain elements. Putin, of course, does not want stability in this part of the world. What he wants is a capitulation by the neighborhood and supported by us. He understands now, I think, more than ever, that this will not be the case. And I hope that this will still open an off-ramp for him, or a way to climb down the tree that he has chosen. It was not us who started all of this, but it is a situation that we are in now with 110,000 or even more soldiers surrounding Ukraine. Is certainly one that reminded me of the situation in the Balsavoor 2015, when we had Ukrainian forces surrounded by Russian and separatist forces, and then we came to the table in Minsk to negotiate the Minsk package of measures. This is not the best way to do business, as we know from them, but we certainly have to stand together and make our opinions very clear to Russia. Otherwise, it will not work. We didn't have that level of coordination back in 2008, and with Fiona. This was certainly not the best moment for European and transatlantic diplomacy, but we've learned a lot from them. And through 2014, and here I would even argue that we were quick in our reactions on sanctions. Okay, we could not prevent the MH17, which of course was the most tragic event in the summer of 2014, but this at least triggered the huge package of economic sanctions that we are now having in the EU ever since July 2014, and this is one of the most important instruments in our hands. Maybe a quick remark on the humanitarian issue that Stefan Meister mentioned. Yes, of course, we are also looking at the possible or potential humanitarian fallout of whatever sort of reaction or action there might be. We're also thinking a lot, of course, about our German nationals here, and these are questions which are constantly discussed also in Berlin. Maybe I leave it there.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you started also with you ended your presentation in a positive note. This is maybe a chance also for the European security order. I would really also ask you this question. So where do we can find this compromise, and is Russia really interested at the moment to find it? Because I think we are now somewhere else in the discussion, and I also want to ask you for your response to this, even if I want to believe, yeah, what what you have said.
I'll be very quick, Stefan. On this issue, I guess diplomats have always to remain somewhat optimistic. Otherwise, it would be the end of their trade, of course. But I'm not overly optimistic. I know very well where we are, and I agree that from many points of view, the Russian government, the Russian leadership can give the impression that the only thing they're looking for is disruption, to destabilize Europe, to divide Europeans. But here, I think you have to take also into account an additional factor, which is that, and I think Putin has said it publicly, he's quite certain that Western democracies are in a sort of irreversible decline. So to some extent, maybe Moscow thinks that it can just wait and see what will come out of this. So my impression is that they're smarter than that, and that they understand that it's more complicated, that European stability could at the end of the day be also in their favor. I don't think any leader of any nation state can believe for 1 second that being constantly on the disruptive mode will at the end be a successful way of managing foreign policy. That doesn't work that way. At some time, at time or another, a boomerang effect comes in, and one can see that time and again in history. So it seems to me that to start from the point of view, which is what everybody thinks at the end of the day, that we have to wait for Putin to leave power to hope to negotiate with Russia, seems to me to be somewhat far-fetched and the wrong way to proceed. So once again, I think that the approach whereby you start, step by step, putting stones one on another and trying to move forward remains the only approach possible, and one that is just as realistic as waiting for a change in the Russian leadership or in the Russian political regime. The second point I would like to underline is when you were saying this is a crisis exclusively about Ukraine. Ukraine is the name of the game. I'm not so sure. Ukraine, for the time being, is really at the center of it all, and I agree. But why precisely is Macron and France and others talking about the need to look at the overall European security order is because you have other bones of contentions that are there. You have Georgia. You may have Moldova one of these days. You may even have Belarus if at one point the opposition starts scoring some points against Lukashenko. So if you really want to look for the long-term game, you need to look at all of this, and you have to settle all these different issues that are there. And once again, you have to look at what is really there, the short-term ones like Ukraine, but you will have to go further on and look at the longer perspective. Last point, very briefly on sanctions. It happens that through my own experience in the External Action Service, I was very much party to the 2014 sanctions package. And everybody told us at that point that we would never succeed, first of all, in coordinating ourselves with the American side, and we did, and it worked very well, and that we will never manage to get a united Europe on sanctions. And by the way, we were 28 at the time. Britain was on board still, and we managed. Discussions were difficult. I remember some difficult debate inside the European Council. But at the end of the day, everybody came up on the same line for one single reason. It was the idea that unity was our main asset with regard to Russia. And that by the end of the day, even if we had disagreements, we should stay united and go for a sanction package as the one that was on the table at the time. So I think one shouldn't underestimate the ability of the Europeans to remain united when time requires for that unity.
Thank you very much. Just a short advertisement. If you want to further discuss this topic, next Tuesday, 6:30, we have a discussion on Russian European Security Order with Angela Stant, Dimitri Suslov, and Neil Schmidt and myself. I really want to thank, Fiona has to leave. Thank you, Fiona, very much. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think you're on the next panel maybe. And I would like to thank all the speakers. I think that has been really a great panel, a great discussion. And I think it's also important to discuss this on this diplomatic and international level. Yeah, and I think we also see how difficult the response is, but I think it was really very good discussion, a lot of excellent questions. And I want to thank, beside the panel and the people who participated, also the team of DGAP, and want to thank and looking forward for the next event, and have a nice meeting.